to see you all. Just a quick note that next Monday is going to be particularly fun because we'll be inducting the new senior research fellows for the workshop. So hopefully you can make it to that either in person or online. That's always a neat celebration to wind up somehow. We're at the end of term, right? I know, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. But Cullen, thank you so much. This is going to be a great discussion. And Jess, yeah, no, please go ahead.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. This is Professor Cullen Hendrix, who is a professor at the Corbel School of International Studies at University of Denver. He has a host of other appointments, including non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, as well as the Center for Climate Change or Climate and Security. He studies conflict and cooperation around natural resources and the security implications for climate change, and is the author of 2 books and way too many articles to count, in outlets ranging from Nature and Sustainability Sciences to British Journal of Political Science. He writes on violence and civil disobedience and climate change and the environment, all incredibly, obviously important and central topics at this very moment. I should also say he has facilitated and produced a number of important data sets for those of us that work in this area. I, for one, have used the Social Conflict in Africa data set and found it very important for my own work. So thank you for that. Today's paper is about regional fishery management organizations and sort of drivers of and climate change resilience among these organizations. Before I turn it over to Cullen, I just want to go over a little bit of the rules of the game, as it were. So Cullen will do his presentation, and then I will keep track of chat-related questions and comments. So either put your questions into the chat or just let me know that you have a question, and I will keep the queue and moderate. And perhaps somebody in the room down there, Angie or whoever, could let me know if there's somebody in person that would like to ask a question, because I can sort of see some of you. But all right. And then hopefully, Cullen, I forgot to ask, I don't know if you're available to hang around for maybe 10-15 minutes or a little more after your presentation, after one, if the conversation is still going, which I assume it will be. If you're available to continue the chat, just let us know. That'd be great.
Well, I'd be happy to, and this is definitely work in progress. So any and all feedback is appreciated. So thank you very much for that.
Great. We're really looking forward to it, and we're so glad you're able to join us today. And without further additional introduction, because I fear I would go on too long, I will turn it over to Cullen, and look forward to again handling your chats and your questions and comments in the chat. All right, Cullen, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So it's a real honor to be here, and I'm going to be presenting some work that's in progress. This particular paper is co-authored with Joshua Lambert at UCF, and then Zachary Lean, who's an incoming PhD student at Northwestern University. And it's part of a larger project that is examining threats to peace and security that may emerge around fisheries conflict, and whether or not kind of existing institutions for managing fisheries in the open oceans are sort of going to be equal to the task of addressing some of the unique kinds of drivers of potential fisheries conflict that are going to be associated with climate change. This is a very savvy audience, so I won't belabor many details about the state of our oceans, except to say that it is safe to say that they are in crisis. An astounding proportion of the world's economically important and food security terms important fisheries are being harvested currently unsustainably, and climate change is only likely to exacerbate some of those negative trends. What you see here is a map that was printed in Beth Mendenhall's and our team's piece that was published in Marine Policy in 2020 that overlays data on the percent change in maximum catch potential. This is expressed in dollar terms for the world's EEZs by the 2050s due to climate change. They're updated figures, but they tell largely the same story. The updated figures have been augmented by information on localized heating or warming in the ocean waters. And what we're seeing is essentially uniformly negative, and in some cases very drastic effects for the fisheries around the equators. That the only sort of limited kind of positive effects are closer to the poles, as migratory fish populations and even populations we haven't historically thought of as being particularly migratory begin moving closer to the poles in search of cooler waters and more habitable climates. And you can see that for some of the EEZs there in East and Southeast Asia, the declines are precipitous, up to 75% and even more in some cases. And we're concerned because this fisheries abundance or relative abundance and conflict over fisheries has been a driver of political conflict and militarized conflict around fisheries in the past. And so I would like to highlight just specifically this particular region, which is the East and South China Seas. These are all, those seas are adjoined by major fishing nations where they provide an incredible amount of economic resources, but then also food security and income security and livelihood security for local populations. And this is also an area where there are relatively high pre-existing diplomatic and geopolitical tensions between regional players. And so our team, in part of the project I won't be talking much about, has gone back through and used the militarized interstate dispute database, which is sort of the baddest thing running in interstate conflict event data out there, and used natural language processing and a couple of other techniques to mine that for the militarized interstate disputes, threats or shows or actual use of force, often resulting in death, around fisheries resources, broadly defined. I can get technical if you'd like. And we do see a significant clustering in the East and South China Seas. And we also see that it is in these ocean regions in which there is a relatively strong climate signal, so to speak, in the patterns of these kinds of conflicts. We've looked at El Nino, which is the major driver of kind of year-to-year variability in the global climate system, and have found that during El Nino years, the baseline probability of the initiation of one of these kind of militarized disputes is 2 or 3 times higher than it would be in a non-El Nino year. So there's good prima facie reason to believe that climate can be associated with these kind of conflicts in the future. So as I mentioned, this is part of a broader project. The first part is assessing evidence for past climate effects on fisheries conflict. Today, we'll be living in the second kind of leg of this, which is to investigate the sources of climate resilience in ocean governance, particularly regional fisheries management organizations. Can I see a show of hands just how many people are already familiar with RFMOs? Okay, we've got a couple, which means I'm in trouble. So many people don't know much and some people know way more than I do. So RFMOs are these interesting co-management international organizations of countries that share practical and economic interest in conserving fish stocks in a particular ocean region. The 12 RFMOs that I'm going to be looking at have kind of a few things in common, and one of them is sort of the extent of the different types of tasks that they undertake. These are organizations that collect, compile, and then publish data on the state of managed fisheries, and in some instances of kind of non-managed fisheries that are back-ended through kind of the ecosystem approach, which looks at sort of prey species for piscivores, for instance. And they assess these data. They assess management practices on a kind of a country-by-country level, and they can also assign tax or total allowable catch limits and or kind of gear specific practices for specific species. So these are different kind of mechanisms by which you can potentially limit overall fish landings in order to maintain the population at maximum sustainable yield, and or prevent the recruitment of young of year fish into the catch, which obviously would have implications for the future stability of these populations. And they develop and implement enforcement mechanisms. So these are not the strongest IOs in the world, but they do some important things that we associate with kind of international organizations more broadly, which is that they establish kind of standards for the behavior of member states. And they also, to a certain extent, entail sovereignty cost in the sense that states delegate authority that in some way may constrain their kind of future behavior, which is the interesting question from sort of the political science / IR side of the table in this discussion. So just an example of what one of these might look like. So here we have the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. There are 26 parties to this. That's divided between coastal states. So those are states whose EEZ adjoins the high seas area that is governed by the RFMO, and then what are known as distant water fishing nations. So these are the very large, typically very technologically sophisticated far ocean fishing fleets, where you have countries like China, the United States, Korea. There are many others whose vessels travel essentially the extent of the globe. So that they have kind of perceived economic and sustainability interests to a certain extent in ocean fisheries that are far, far, far away from their shores. This is how the United States winds up being part of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. The total extent of the managed area is massive. It's 105 million square kilometers. The size will be important later in the story. And another piece that's important is that they manage tuna and other straddling or highly migratory species. These are species that travel long distances, in some cases thousands of kilometers, in a particular year. And these types of species like tuna and billfish, like our swordfish friend that we see here, pose kind of particularly kind of acute management issues for a variety of reasons. One of them being that they are very economically valuable, and they're the subject of intense interest in fishing pressure. And because they move around a lot, the health of the stock matters not just for what's occurring in a particular ocean region, but for the treatment that stock is receiving in terms of fishing effort more widely, as they may pass through 10, 20, potentially even 30 of these EEZs in a given time frame. So those are the organizations we'll be looking at. And these organizations were established essentially to try and prevent commons dilemmas. Given the audience, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about what that looks like, but these are exhaustible common pool resources. And they're also subject to both kind of, fairly significant both natural and human-induced variability in their populations, so that you can have variability in the abundance of fish that is a function of kind of primary productivity in the ocean and the abundance of prey and forage food in the food web that determines kind of the number of these larger organisms that are available for human harvesting. But you also have human harvesting, right? And that's occurring in a very difficult kind of monitoring context. As I mentioned earlier, some of these RFMOs are vast, much larger than the territories of many sovereign states, including the largest states in the international system. And so it is difficult to directly observe fishing effort and fish catch, even now where we have much more technologically advanced mechanisms for identifying vessels and ostensibly monitoring catch. And what does a exhaustible common pool resource looks like? It looks like these cod landings off of Newfoundland from 1950 to 2018, where you have a radical increase in fishing pressure in the 1970s, which creates kind of instability in the population dynamics of the cod themselves, which causes ultimately the fishery to collapse in the early 1990s. There's been a moratorium on it since, but I believe that surveys and estimates of biomass suggest that even released from fishing pressure, the cod population has not rebounded to sort of its pre-radical increase in the 1970s, which was due to the arrival of very large far ocean industrialized fishing vessels. Okay, so the challenge here from sort of a political sciencey IR perspective is that in order for these RFMOs to be effective, they need to be delegated relatively broad and relatively deep authority. IR scholars refer to this as the breadth versus depth trade-off in delegation to international organizations. They need to be delegated sufficiently broad management tools in order to manage these fish stocks according to scientific best practices and principles. But they also need to pool sovereignty in the sense that they delegate the authority to these organizations to make binding or more or less binding kinds of constraints, place more or less binding constraints on these sovereign states. So from the IR perspective, what we have here is kind of a classic delegation to supranational agencies or authorities kind of problem. And so the basic question guiding my point of departure on this project is, under what conditions will states accept both greater breadth and depth? Under what circumstances will they delegate broader authority, and under what circumstances will they delegate that authority in a way that allows that institution to place meaningful constraints on the behavior of member states? And so as a jumping off point, just empirically, I just need to go through very briefly kind of the baseline sort of measures I'll be using in this first iteration of this project. And these come to us from Brian Pentz and his team at University of Toronto Scarborough in a 2018 piece in Marine Science, where they assessed 12 major RFMOs according to 28 different criteria by which they were assessing kind of their potential for resilience under climate change. And for our purposes, I've decomposed those sort of 28 dimensions, or excuse me, collapsed those 28 dimensions into 2 dimensions. On the y-axis here, we have conservation and management provisions. So think of this as at the bottom of the scale, you would have management that placed essentially no binding limits on harvesting and did not inform whatever actions were being taken by the RFMO by scientific principles or ecosystem-based management kinds of approaches, where they think holistically about the state of the food web when they're making catch allotment decisions. And at the other end, right, you have, the higher scores, you would have RFMOs that have been delegated very broad authority to manage these things, manage fisheries in accordance with scientific best practices, implement ecosystem-based approaches, et cetera. I can go into more detail in Q&A. And on the other axis, on the x-axis here, you have compliance measures and institutional characteristics. And this is the axis that describes or characterizes the degree to which there are meaningful constraints placed on the members by virtue of their membership in the RFMO. At the very low end here, you would be looking at states where they could unilaterally essentially remove themselves from compliance with any of the stated limits or findings of the RFMO that were oriented around guiding national level policy or harmonizing national level policy. At the high end of that, you have more resilient institutions that allow for the admission of new members, that place binding constraints on the behavior of member states, and also elaborate kind of mechanisms for punishments, right, in order to attempt to enforce compliance. And you have the delegation of authority to kind of majority or supermajority decision-making bodies. It's not the case that every member of the RFMO has a veto, and therefore it's a consensus-based organization where sort of there's a pressure to downwardly harmonize to sort of the least sustainably managed kind of approach. And so these are the 2 axes. At sort of the top end of the scale, you've got the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization and the Convention for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Life Resources. At the bottom end of the scale, you have the Convention for the Conservation of the Bering Sea pollock. I'll talk a lot about that one later. And then you have, the CCBSP ranks very low on compliance measures and institutional characteristics, and also relatively low on conservation management provisions. NAFO and CCAMLR are at the high end on both. And then you have other RFMOs like the IOTC, which are moving in the direction of having binding constraints on the behavior of sovereign states and thus the fisheries that they govern, while not necessarily invoking kind of best practices from a conservation management perspective. Okay, so there is meaningful variation on kind of both axes here. The literature is here. There's this literature that the fisheries people have developed looking at the institutional features and performance and properties of managed stocks and managed areas. This is essentially a how's my driving, how are we doing kind of approach. How effective are they? And interestingly, this literature has very little to say on why some RFMOs might be performing better than others, or why some RFMOs to our present point, in theory, are potentially more resilient under climate change than others. And that question, why do RFMOs behave differently or perform differently, is in the wheelhouse of the IR folks who are looking at collective action and then rational design of international organizations. So some of the theoretical conjectures we'll be talking about are predicated in kind of the initial kind of the initial salvos and kind of the logic of collective action kind of literature, but then also kind of the management of common pool resources that has been supplemented by international relations scholars' attention to how states manage their delegation of authority to international organizations. I have to move very quickly, so I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as I can. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at the paper. So we developed 6 theoretical expectations. The first 2 relate essentially to the biological or ecological properties of the stocks under management, under the supposition under different conditions, stocks will be more or less amenable to conservation-based management and broad delegation. The first is that RFMO resilience to climate change will be lesser in RFMOs managing straddling and highly migratory stocks, in part because of the monitoring and compliance issues that are engendered by having these highly mobile species. In a given year, you can't know whether or not sort of a decline in the catch of country X is due to natural variability in the population dynamics of that species. You can try to know that, but it's very difficult to know, or whether it's due to country Y over harvesting. And under conditions where it's difficult to monitor compliance, we would expect less thick and broad delegation to these international organizations. And the second is that for similar reasons, for observability and surveillability of compliance, RFMO resilience we expect might be negatively associated with the size of its area of competence. In addition to that, we have a variety of theoretical expectations, which get into more kind of political, economic, and then geopolitical factors that might condition delegation and therefore observed resilience of RFMOs. The first one is the RFMO resilience to climate change will be inversely related to the number of contracting parties. This is coming to us from kind of a standard sort of veto player's logic, in which as the number of parties that need to agree to a framework for making making decisions in an institutional environment increases, the size of the things that they will be able to agree upon is going to be non-increasing and likely decreasing. The second among these, the RFMOs whose members have larger proportional stakes in fisheries and better scientific and technical capacity will be more resilient to climate change. And this insight is kind of derived from the logic of privileged groups in collective action scenarios, where you have actors who have such an overwhelming interest in the public good, i.e. the RFMO governance being provided, that they are willing to provide it and the resources necessary for its operation, even under circumstances in which it cannot guarantee sort of compliance across the other member states. Our third here is that RFMO resilience to climate change will be positively related to the prevalence of democracies in their membership. So as the membership of these RFMOs are more democratic on average, you're going to be ameliorating some of the issues related to trust and also availability of information about the preferences of other actors with regards to their fisheries, i.e. that this is just another way of saying that the domestic politics of their fisheries sectors and the interests around them are less opaque than they would be in more closed authoritarian political systems. And then finally, RFMO resilience to climate change will be negatively associated with diplomatic tensions and past histories of conflict between members. If we think that trust is an important factor for establishing effective delegation and broad and deep delegation to RFMOs, right? These are the kinds of factors that are going to decrease international cooperation around a host of issues. There is some literature on transboundary management of rivers, which suggests that these kinds of security arrangements can be overcome, or security relationships can be overcome by overwhelming interest in the shared resource. But even our best examples of that, like the Indus River Commission, have highly circumscribed delegated authority corresponding to relatively narrow and shallow delegation. So these are our theoretical expectations, elaborated at more length in the paper, obviously. The evidence as yet is I would say it is nascent, and it is illustrative of some trends, but it is by far it's far away from being an open and shut case, because we have a terribly small n with which to work. We do not find support for our conjectures around highly migratory or straddling stocks. There may be a little bit of something there with respect to the conservation management axis, but nothing there with respect to the breadth, the depth of delegation in terms of institutional constraints. Nothing with geographic extent, nothing with the number of parties. Where we do find some effects are larger stakeholders with higher scientific capacity, and the relevant kind of comparison here would be the CCAMLR versus the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. In the former, the fishery is almost entirely dominated by Norway, which is a country that has the largest economic stake in the fishery by far, and also has very high kind of technical and scientific capacity. You could also argue an orientation around conservation of marine resources as well, versus the IOTC, most of whose member states have relatively smaller proportional shares in the fisheries that are governed, and have relatively less scientific and technical capacity. So they're lacking just kind of the basic capacity to inform practices that would inform conservation-based management kinds of approaches. And then more democratic membership, we see some of this in the comparison, which I'll go into in a moment, between the CCBSP and NAFO, and also geopolitical tensions and past conflict history. And that's also supported by those two cases. The problem there being that at this point, it's very difficult to parse the relative effects of those two factors. So to compare, this is a tale of two RFMOs. So from a technical perspective, the CCBSP should have one of the more tractable management tasks in front of it. In terms of being the smallest RFMO by far, it's roughly double the size of Hokkaido Island. Contrast that with the size of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, and it has relatively few contracting parties. Even just compared to NAFO, which is one of the most kind of climate resilient RFMOs, which has many more contracting parties. What matters here, though, is who those contracting parties seem to be. So in the case of the CCBSP, which was formed in the aftermath of the Cold War, all of the parties, right, China, South Korea, Japan, Poland, maybe less so, but Russia and the United States, have complicated geopolitical histories with one another. And if you add into the fact that North Korea and Taiwan also have fished in this area, especially in the 1980s and the lead up to this, the creation of this institution, you have a very kind of dense environment of troubled security relationships. And also, based on our previous data collection project, past significant histories of fisheries conflict. In NAF, and you also obviously have heterogeneity with regime type, with consolidated democracies, along with hardline autocratic governments. In NAFO, the management problem here and the proportional stakes in the fishery that are large belong to the United States, Canada, and Denmark. And for a variety of reasons, we might expect that those three countries would have higher capacity to manage these fisheries and according to best practices, but then also are more democratic and do not have the previous kind of tensions on the security side of things that might inhibit broad and deep kind of cooperation and therefore delegation to these RFMOs. There are some limitations here, and I'm going to stop with this because I'm a little over time. There are obviously missing and unexplored factors. One of them I sort of previewed was that the economic salience of certain fisheries may be higher than others. There are insights from this contracting for property rights kind of literature, which say, well, yeah, you're going to have, some of these fisheries aren't economically important, that there are going to be high stakes over the kinds of delegation that take place because there's a shared interest in positive management, but they're not overwhelming kind of negative constituencies within any of the countries that might have overriding economic interest that would block those. And the other is timing of formation. Some of these were simply formed after, much later in the post kind of war era in the 1990s, when there was just a better understanding of kind of scientific and ecosystem management based approaches to fisheries governance. It's also snapshot assessment based. So there's no theory or evidence of change over time here, which is a problem. And then there are issues with endogeneity. Given that many of these organizations' current membership is a function of changing membership over time with the addition of other parties, it may be the case, and is in fact likely the case, I'll be honest, that the number of contracting parties and therefore all of these other various attributes that they have are going to be somewhat endogenous to the nature of the existing RFMO. So I need to think more deeply about how to tackle that. And all of this is being done with a vanishingly limited number of cases. We have 12 here. If we wanted to extend our data collection project, we could probably get out to 18, which would be backward kind of compatible with existing work on RFMOs. But I think it's an important enough kind of question to be asking and attempting to answer that I'm willing to live with all of the limitations that imposes, because that's the reality of the world we live in. At this point, I'm going to stop my formal presentation. I'm sorry it was over. I was anticipating speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, so I needed to condense things significantly. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any feedback or questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and the graphics were super helpful as well. So thanks for that. Okay, so I think the first hand that I saw up was Vicky Moretsky. If you're there, I'll turn over to you, and then let me know in the chat. I have plenty of my own questions if people are still thinking of some, but let me know in the chat. Vicky, are you there? Was that an accidental hand up? It's possible. It looks like it might be. All right, we'll turn over to Scott and Vicky if you are there. Let me know. Scott, go ahead.
Absolutely, Vicky. We can circle back. But yeah, we had a hand go up in the Ostrom room already, and I'm happy to help
Great.
with that. So yes, please.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. I'm not sure if I'm sitting. I don't even know where the microphone is. But anyway, I wanted to go back to your point that you raised that I actually have two questions. One about this point that you raised at the end, which is that you're not looking at change over time, and to ask if there maybe is a way to get into that, because I'm thinking about how within, and my specialty is more within the International River Basins organizations, the fact that their mandate does actually substantially change over time as countries renegotiate and add to it. And usually, in many instances with the river basin organizations, when a new challenge arises and they don't have an existing forum for countries to deal with it, they just allocate that new challenge to the existing river basin organization. And so it keeps building upon the existing one. And so I was wondering if there's a way to look at that change, because that may well influence why they start to have more and more authorities over time. And if not, if thinking about how, and you may not have the data for that, but if not, maybe there's a way to look at the institutional structure through which the mandate shifts. Could be added as an addition, as a sort of snapshot moment, but at least to recognize the flexibility in adding a new element over time.
Thank
So
you.
that's question number one. And question number two is
Okay,
just,
great.
if you looked at policy diffusion as a way of explaining why certain groups, because it may be that every time the US is involved or every time Japan is involved, because they borrow from one treaty to pull to another, that they tend to use similar elements. So I'm wondering if you also looked at sort of clustering of that.
No, okay, two great questions. And these are things that we've thought about, but haven't really kind of fully tracked down yet. So I'll answer them kind of in reverse order. So in the first case, with respect to your second question, one of the things that we're doing is we're compiling kind of historical documents related to these various RFMOs. And then one member of our team who does kind of machine learning and natural language processing and the like is going to be kind of mining those to kind of look at institutional change or changes in mandate over time. So that speaks a little bit to kind of the first question that you raised, but it also speaks to the ability, because we will be using kind of natural language processing and sentiment analysis and topic modeling, that we can actually look for when sort of new members enter into RFMOs. Does it substantially change the discourse? Or are there properties of individual countries operating in different RFMOs that affect the kind of language that is used in them? In my little part of the world, in terms of thinking about international economic agreements, we know that this is the case with respect to, say, trade agreements that the United States is a party to. They harvest a lot of language and ideas from those. And then to your first question, this is something that we are trying to tackle, this kind of change over time and change in membership over time. And so we have data on part of that story, and that's looking at kind of dispute resolution mechanisms and governance mechanisms. So think about kind of the x-axis in the figure that you saw earlier, in RFMOs going back to 1948 and covering up until 2020 or 2021. And so we will be able to, it'll be different measures from what Pentz and et al. Are using, but we will at least be able to characterize kind of change in the decision-making processes and the kind of binding constraints that these RFMOs can put in place over time. So we will be able to look at that, and we can look at that as a function of changing membership. We can look at that as a function of just kind of, I guess I'd say just sort of kind of natural kind of expansion of delegated authority as new problems and the like arise. And also as a function of composition of membership. And because we'll have the temporal sequencing of that, we'll be able to say something a little bit more conclusively about, all right, is this occurring because new countries are joining the RFMO, or is this occurring because this RFMO has nice properties for this country's fisheries sector, and therefore they're willing to subject themselves to its authority. one more point on that is just that in some senses, so we do have a discontinuity that comes because of the fish stocks agreement in 1995, the UN convention, which essentially mandates membership in these RFMOs for members of the UN system. And so for a certain subset of RFMOs that were created in the aftermath of the fish stocks agreement, we have this kind of, it's not really approximating kind of a natural experiment, but we do have less of a obvious selection by member states into the RFMO. We can't, at least at this point from that, directly observe the extent to which they participate actively in the RFMO, which would be an interesting thing to know in its own right. So hopefully that addresses some of those questions.
All right, Scott, are there any more in the room there?
I think we're okay right this second, Jess. I'm sure we could think of some if needed.
Okay,
Though.
well, I have several questions. So I find this really, really interesting. And I had a few specific questions. One related to the sort of theoretical relationship here, because there's lots built on or IR scholarship around these IOs and like how they function, et cetera. And it seems to me that your sort of theoretical argument is some set of variables X leads to either deep or shallow delegation, right? If we think about these having sort of like two dimensions, which then leads to some level of climate resilience in the fisheries that these RFMOs manage. Would that be an accurate sort of?
It is accurate in it, but with the caveat that what the state of the managed fisheries is kind of the next link in the chain. And the difficulty being here that there's endogeneity of kind of the state of the fisheries to the breadth of delegation to the, or there's endogeneity of the breadth of delegation to the RFMOs to the state of the fishery, because many of these fisheries were harvested historically to a point way beyond maximum sustainable yield, and therefore kind of looking at sort of a similar kind of snapshot of whether or not the RFMO is effective by the status of managed stocks may be kind of misleading. But yes, overall.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So that was going to be my next question, is because it seems like, we, like the conversation is like the outcome is really about this sort of characteristic of delegation, the extent to which principals are willing to delegate to agents, what kinds of tasks and at what level. And it seems to me then the question, I guess my question is are we really talking about institutional robustness to particular shocks? Or are we talking about institutional adaptability to a particularly complex and dynamic system? And particularly because there's not a lot of conversation in what you posted, and as you just suggested, there's good reason maybe not to focus explicitly on level of, like how close they are to sustainable catch at one point in time. But I am just curious about how you're mapping these characteristics of the institution, whether it's robustness or adaptability, or whether we're thinking of those as the same things, onto particular kinds of complex outcomes in the natural environment that we're interested in. So that's like my larger question.
Okay.
I have plenty others, but I'll just start with that one.
Okay, so ideally, resilience would be, I guess, encompass kind of the two different conceptualizations that you kind of put on the table, right? So resilience to particular shocks and the ability of the management tools to kick in to bring it back to its previous state, to prevent situations, right, like the Newfoundland cod fishery, right? And then the other one is just sort of the recognition that this is a management task that's going to be occurring, that is occurring under a high degree of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is increasing over time as a function of changing climate, changing habitat, and food webs underlying these various kind of managed species. I can say that the way that and this may be unsatisfying, the way that I'm addressing it right now is on the terms that are internal to the way that kind of Brian Pentz and that team, that literature is looking at it. And they're conceiving of it much more along the lines of the latter characterization, right? This is less about, a big shock in technology, or a big shock in terms of some sort of climate related kind of effect that has broad effects for the fishery. They're less focused on that, and they're more focused on saying, all right, if we accept the premise that there's going to be increasing uncertainty, therefore, under increasing uncertainty, these institutions need to be flexible in terms of the types of approaches and ecosystem approaches to management that they can take. And so I don't know if that's satisfying from a theoretical perspective. I buy the idea, relating it back to kind of the IR literature, that the question that a lot, I think, of the IR literature around this is driven by is sort of, you don't know exactly what, if you cannot perfectly anticipate the decisions that these institutions are going to make, then joining these institutions entails significant sovereignty costs. It may come back to bite you later, right? So given that you're dealing in a world of uncertainty, both in terms of the policy outcomes and the actions of other actors, but also the underlying kind of biological systems or ecological systems that you're attempting to manage, how can we ensure that there are going to be meaningful constraints on behavior of states moving forward, and therefore the fisheries the fishing sectors that they govern, and how can we make sure that that delegation is broad enough and includes enough kind of tools that they will be able to address all of the potential changes that may be coming down the pike, acknowledging the fact that, right, the nature of those potential changes coming down the pike is also unknowable and subject to high uncertainty.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, it's almost like responsiveness is kind of what we're focusing on to this level, right? If uncertainty is about sort of unpredictable outcomes, then an outcome happens and they need to be able to respond to it in some way. And they need essentially a breadth of tools and the capacity to implement those tools in order to do so.
Right, and so from my perspective, right, that's sort of captured by these two different axes, right?
Okay.
So one of them is how big is the toolkit, how diverse is the toolkit, and then the other axis is, okay, if they have a great toolkit, that's meaningless if it doesn't actually tie the hands of the different countries to abide by or generate kind of mechanisms for punishing noncompliance, right? And the mechanism for punishing noncompliance aren't necessarily on the order of the kind of remediation you would get out of WTO processes, right? But they do vary pretty significant.
All right, thanks very much. We'll move on to John's question and then Brian.
Great.
Just a follow-up, and I think it ties in pretty closely. I mean, as you were presenting this, I was thinking, what would happen if fingers crossed, tomorrow somebody just invents a machine that solves climate change, right? That all those problems go away and that's no longer an issue we have to confront. Mm-hmm. Is there anything fundamentally different about the analysis in that situation than in the one that we actually live in? Like the climate dimension of what you present, I see it as a relevant motivation, right? Clearly the costs of weak governance are increasing and compounding given the effects of climate change. But is there anything inherent to climate change that that frames this analysis and makes it unique, as opposed to just a more general assessment of the strengths of institutional governance?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think that on the first part, you're absolutely right. This is kind of one of the motivating factors for thinking about this, because my interest is whether or not these institutions are going to be robust enough moving forward, to using Jess's word there in terms of robustness, right, to prevent the kinds of conflicts over these resources, right, or claims on these resources playing out violently. Especially given sort of the major power status of many of the fishing nations that we're talking about here. The parts of it that are, and I didn't tease it out, but maybe your comment will be helpful in getting me to think about this. So what are the things that are unique to climate change that are going to differentiate this from sort of best practices in terms of just a purely kind of conservation lens, assuming static environment, right? And I think that the part of that I would go in just off the top of my head, I mean, I think that one of the more important ones would be, do they have provisions for kind of the entrance and exit of different countries into these agreements? So some of these are heavily circumscribed. So the Bering Sea RFMO that I showed you has no provisions for other countries joining it. Regardless of whether or not due to climate change, there are going to be different countries that will potentially have an interest in the fishery. And you could say the same about a lot of the other RFMOs. I haven't decomposed it to look specifically at that, but I think that you're right that that would be an interesting kind of third dimension at which to look. Currently, that's kind of subsumed within the kind of the compliance measures and institutional characteristics under a variety of indicators that capture basically, can this institution reform and reshape itself over time? And so that is there, but that would be because I think with, if you think that one of the primary drivers is going to be migration, then there are going to be fishing fleets with the technology and the gears and the know-how that are going to be just encouraged to move into different ocean territories than they've been fishing previously. And therefore membership composition flexibility would be important.
So just to follow up real quick, I can only speak to kind of the microeconomic literature, but I'm sure it extends into IR stuff as well. The threat of renegotiability and the contracting, schemas can be so problematic, right? That's being able to make credible commitments and everything that follows from that. But here you have a case where the need to adapt to change is sort of heightened given the dynamism and the uncertainty, like you said, that climate introduces. So I would wonder if there's maybe some potential tension there between the credible commitments on the front end, if you're ceding sovereignty, that it be constrained in some way, how much is being ceded, versus the effectiveness of a static organization or an overly binding institutional framework, given not just changes in levels of stocks, but even entirely new species emerging and showing up and needing to be managed. So I would wonder, just throw that out there as a potential something to look at as an area that might be unique relative to climate change as opposed to a more predictable system.
So that's a great observation. And just very briefly on that, I mean, this is the crux of the issue that you just outlined, kind of, not necessarily thinking about purely in terms of kind of time inconsistency and incomplete information for contract, like renegotiability of contracts under deep uncertainty. I mean, this is what you just stated is kind of the logic behind why it is that IR scholars think about these things as a trade-off, right? So if I want to make sure that an institution can do most anything moving forward, that's fine, but I will give it a very short leash in terms of how much delegated authority I will give it, because I don't want to wind up in a situation where I am in the future kind of constrained by actions by that institution that I cannot anticipate. And then on the other hand, if I have a very good sense of what that system looks like, right? So if you think about the property rights literature under private goods that are, et cetera, right there, you have very narrow kind of circumscription, but you have extreme authority delegated because there's just a high degree of predictability in those kinds of systems. And so that is something that's there. I haven't linked it to kind of the microeconomic work because it's to the extent that I do economic stuff, it's definitely more on the macro side. But I think that is one of the points of departure of a lot of the IR scholars operating in this literature who are informed by kind of principal agent theory, collective principles, contracting, et cetera. So thank you. That's useful. I mean, that also might be a different. It might suggest that there are ways I could frame this to make it more potentially interesting to a crowd that's viewing it more from kind of explicitly the contracting perspective. Thank you.
All right, Brian, and then Orr.
Good. So it's a nice, clear presentation, and also in the paper about the research and how it was set up and the findings. And there are a bunch of things I could ask, some of which I might talk after we finish the official oral part. But what I'd ask about here, listening to some of your hypotheses and maybe in relation to your larger project, to what extent is there already, or does this relate, and I'm putting my question in the chat, some kind of systematic model or theory of change or something that would let you, for example, trace through, okay, climate change may have different impacts, or like your initial map, more severe impacts in some places, and what does this mean for different organizations and responses? Or, and this is where I come from a bit of Ostrovian problem solving, institutional ownership, institutional design, what does this mean for understanding something like, what you alluded to, their technological improvements and ability to monitor, but my understanding there are also some real normative shifts and stronger pressures to actually apply monitoring and look at people who are evading monitoring and how to deal with all that. So I don't know whether this is part of your larger project, or you would see what you're doing may contribute to these kind of questions, or maybe you largely have different questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that the way that you framed it, when I get a little bit smarter, I'll be able to do this in this sense, because I think you're relating it back to like, what are the kind of core questions that would be of interest to social scientists and people who are interested in kind of conservation at a variety of scales and at a governing a variety of different types of common pool resources. And so at present, I have not thought about it explicitly in those terms, because I do not have, and maybe this suggests it would be a better way of unifying this under kind of a more defined kind of theoretical kind of architecture, would be to, instead of jumping directly to kind of operationalization and thinking about it narrowly in terms of these types of institutions, say in a book project, having a chapter that's much more about kind of a theory of change over time and different responses, that is, I guess, more abstracted from kind of the narrow focus on fisheries. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing kind of the suggestion that's coming there. On the second part of that, the piece where we're looking at this in terms of change over time, one of the reasons in which we were interested in doing kind of the topic modeling and exercise, which is what Josh is heading up, is that we're interested not just in kind of what are the formal decisions that are made in these institutions, but how is the discourse in these institutions changing over time? Are we hearing more about, at some point, IUU is a relatively kind of minor concern for many of these organizations. Now they all talk about it, right? At some point, sort of ecosystem-based approaches to management were considered kind of a technical sort of issue in terms of the population modeling and understanding the underlying population dynamics. Now they're thought of, I think, in also kind of normative terms, in the sense that like, this is not just kind of the right way to do it for scientific reasons, but it fits into a much more holistic understanding of ocean health. And therefore it is a good thing eo ipso, independent of its effect on kind of total allowable catches, for instance. And so, this couple of articles, if I'm going to go in that direction, probably needs to look something a little bit more like a book manuscript, because at present I don't have kind of a unifying theory for kind of institutional emergence, in part because the provenance of these different institutions is not uniform, right? These aren't all, hey, let's solve our collective dilemma. A lot of these were kind of imposed by a broader engagement in collective action, which was the fish stocks agreement under the more general kind of UN architecture. I hope I got somewhere in the ballpark of answering or responding to your questions.
Yeah, I'll just quickly follow up. Part of this gets to the question of institutional development and whether and to what extent it's possible to think about that in terms of kind of developing generic capacity. And Jess was mentioning ideas of resilience and what you're looking at, and to what extent, in a sense, you really have to dive into the weeds or the nuts and bolts of the specific solving specific problems and specific capacities that are developed for that, which then may have broader application and create precedents and so on. But anyway.
No, I think that's a good point. And I think that maybe one of the things I could do in kind of a longer form piece would be to establish sort of the way in which these institutions mandate and the underlying task at hand, if you want to think of it that way, is alike. Which is they're alike in many respects, but they're different in some kind of important sorts of ways. And then that would be kind of a deeper theory that would get you to explaining some of the institutional variation, right? But would also get you in the direction of thinking about, all right, if we have some of these that are not dealing with migratory or highly migratory stocks and some that are, do we need to build up kind of different theories for what are the management challenges that are associated with these two things? I mean, in addition to that, right, the other thing that we could be adding in as an additional layer of kind of complexity, but this might be satisfying also in terms of answering John's question, is let's look at the areas that are being managed. Let's look at the specific species that are being managed and say, how is climate change likely to impact these managed stocks specifically in a way that is going to require greater breadth of delegated kinds of authorities, right? So if the effect on Antarctic krill has to do with productivity, but doesn't have much to do with the sort of the geographic distribution of the harvested species, I'm just guessing, I don't know off the top of my head, right? That's a different problem than if you have both kind of change in the dynamics, the population dynamics of the species, and you have change in their location, right? And that was sort of the intuition, the deeper kind of intuition behind why the straddling stocks and highly migratory part of this would be important. But yeah, thank you very much for that.
Okay, we only actually have a few minutes until the 1 p.m. deadline, although we're gonna continue conversation after that. So what I want to do is a quick rapid fire, first Orr and then Scott, and then maybe Cullen, you can respond to both of those, and then whoever is available can hang around after. Does that sound good?
Mhm.
All right, go for it, Orr.
Thank you. Thanks, Cullen, for the presentation. I apologize. I was teaching, so I ended my class early, but I still missed some of it. So if my comments are offline, I apologize. So I have both kind of theoretical and empirical parts. Theoretically, so I am much more of a punctuated equilibrium person. So I'm kind of more in line with what Jess was saying, that it has to do, I mean, you're describing something that sounds to me a lot like diffusion, right? But especially when you take environmental kind of effects into account, most of this is punctuated equilibrium by definition if you write a stick-to-group kind of argument, right? And so I'm wondering if the linear over time part is as relevant in response to shocks and how that creates a sort of an adaptation of those systems. In those institutions, right? I mean, like basically every major institution has evolved because of some sort of shock, or at least initiating initiation. So I was wondering kind of if there is element of this theoretical kind of perspective or way to be developing. The second thing I was wondering is, so that's more empirical, but when I'm trying to identify the effect of fisheries on conflict, or I'm starting to see, like, if I were doing, like, when I'm doing local agricultural production, I use like drought levels, right? It sounds like you could use something like water salinity. I was wondering if you ever thought of some kind of creative instrument here, because that would be an interesting, just from a empirical perspective, a really interesting way of thinking of some of those effects, right? Because the only way that water salinity could affect this would be by affecting. So those are the two, right? Like the direct effect will have to come to that instrument that fisheries talk. So again, just two thoughts I had.
Okay, thank you. I've got those. Okay, thanks. And then what was the other question?
Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just a really quick one in the interest of time. And if there's anybody else in the room that I missed, let me know as well. But first off, this has just been fantastic. So thank you so much, Cullen. And just a quick comment that I got interested in a somewhat similar set of issues back during my doctoral work. And it started off, I'm a lawyer by training, so it started off as, frankly, a boring, very long law review article looking at, was Selden right, basically, in this kind of whole closed seat question. But I spun it out, and partly in a book, and I'll send you a link to some of it because I'd love to start a dialogue, but it looked in particular at this issue of roving bandits and these vessel monitoring services that you kind of loosely referenced. And back when I was looking at it, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea had just started requiring more states to engage in information sharing to help with this issue of roving bandits, given, as you said, that the resource endowments, the sophistication of coastal states really, really varies. And that's just not something I followed up on since. So I was just curious if you knew much about how that was playing out these days, and if information sharing is getting better to help with this kind of communication coordination aspect, or if we're still a pretty long way from that.
Okay, great. Very, very briefly, Ori, I think that the point about punctuated equilibrium, I haven't thought about explicitly in those purposes, but I think that would be fascinating to look at, in part because we could look at that, the shocks that occur, say, by virtue of technology that apply broadly to a variety of different RFMOs, and then also kind of localized sort of environmental shocks in the oceans that might have more significant effects for kind of change in one RFMO at a specific time. So I won't say much more than that. And then in terms of kind of disaggregating sort of and getting at some of the more kind of proximate drivers that would be capturing sort of climatic variability at the global scale in the water, I think there are good reasons to do that. I think that there may be potentially, it inherits a lot of the issues that you and I have both kind of gone back and forth about and discussed at length about kind of the geographic disaggregation and the degree to which that may, you're trading off kind of specificity around certain mechanisms with an inability necessarily to capture broader mechanisms that may not operate at those kind of resolved sort of spatial scales. And then on this question about kind of reporting and monitoring, I mean, I do think that there are a variety of things, including kind of the Port States Agreement that have been instituted in relatively recent past, that suggests that there is more information sharing and more of an ability to, or more of a willingness to kind of make sort of credible ex-ante commitments to cooperating around issues to solve what you referred to as the roving bandit issue, right? So this is IUU fishing, but this is also, sort of far ocean or distant water fishing fleets that are not necessarily operating according to best practices, even if they are there under the, under the invitation of a national government via a licensing agreement. We see a lot of this in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, wow, thank you very much. This is awesome. I presented this paper at the Pitt Political Science Department, and that was fun, but there was a lot of head scratching about some of the, the kind of the conservation side of things. And it was just a real joy to have folks diving in much more on the environmental side of things and who also could speak to that. I'm getting a great amount out of both of them. And thank you very much for your time and engagement.
When you look at developers.
Thanks for coming today. We're gonna, if you could stop sharing your screen, Cullen, and then we'll be able to just say a thanks to everyone that was here, that is here. And if you can hang around and continue the conversation, we'll be here. And Cullen, thanks for a great presentation.
Okay.